Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly.
Why are Jews liberals? Commentary Magazine editor-in-chief Norman Podhoretz attempts to answer the question he says he's been asked more often than any other during 4 decades in journalism. The Harvard Club hosts this event. It's an hour.
You know, to my amazement, I see a lot of unfamiliar faces here, which leads me to believe that a fair number of you haven't heard the joke I usually tell at this point. One of my favorite Jewish joke, needless to say. I'm going to risk telling it because if you've heard it, it's worth hearing again. And if you haven't heard it, it's doubly worth hearing for the first time. And you'll see. I like to tell it after a generous and flattering introduction, such as I have privileged to receive. It's a joke with an unusual setting, the deathbed of a Hasidic rabbi, or Rebbe as they're called, who's surrounded by his disciples who are weeping and wailing in the demise of their teacher and leader. And one of them says, "Oh, woe is us. How will we survive the death of our Rebbe? He is the wisest man of the age, and who will teach us wisdom when he's gone?" And a second takes up the refrain and says, "How will we survive the death of our Rebbe? He is the most learned man of the age, and who will instruct us in Torah when he is gone?" And the third says, "How will we survive his loss? He's the most virtuous man of the age, and who will set us an example of ethical conduct when he is gone?" And they wept and they wailed, and finally the old man, with the last ounce of strength in his failing body, lifts himself up on his arm and says, "And about my humility you have nothing to say?" I note that Seth had nothing to say about my humility. Well, that's probably the last laugh you're going to get out of me this afternoon, so enjoy it. I've often said, and I say again in this book, that never have I been asked any question on any subject as many times as I've been asked why most Jews, or in its more specifically political form, why most Jews keep voting for the Democrats. But this question immediately gives rise to another question, which is why so many people, and especially non-Jews and especially non-Jewish conservatives, are so puzzled by the political attitudes and behavior that predominate among American Jews. After all, up until the end of World War II, no one would have wondered why most American Jews were liberals, or why they were so committed to the Democratic Party. The answer would have been self-evident. In those days, most American Jews were poor, and this meant that the Democratic Party, which spoke for the interests of people in their socioeconomic condition, was their natural political home. In those days, too, Jews suffered from various forms of discrimination, and this made it inevitable that they would look upon liberal ideas as being good for them. This indeed had been the case for centuries. The ancestors, both immediate and distant, of the vast majority of American Jews had lived in Europe, where the forces that favored the emancipation of the Jews and the granting of civil rights and civil liberties to them had always been located somewhere on the left. And in 20th century America, especially after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the closest counterpart to these forces seemed to be the Democratic Party. Conversely, the political right seemed to represent an American version of the conservative forces in Europe, which had always opposed equal rights for Jews. It made perfect sense then for Jews to align themselves with the left and to keep their distance from the right, where they were in any case most unwelcome. But then something momentous happened that began to rob these political commitments of the sense they had always made. This momentous event was the Six-Day War of 1967. Now, to be sure, even before 1967, in the decades following the end of World War II, Jews found themselves getting more and more out of political step with the other white members of the Roosevelt coalition. The attachment of these non-Jewish ethno-religious groups to the Democrats was steadily declining in direct proportion to the improvement in their economic and social condition, but not the Jews, a substantial majority of whom kept on voting for the Democratic candidate in every presidential election. It was this phenomenon that gave rise to Milton Himmelfarb's deservedly famous epigram, "Jews earn like Episcopalians," who were then the richest of the American ethno-religious groups, and they vote like Puerto Ricans, who were then the poorest ethno-religious groups. In short, by 1967, the Jewish commitment to the Democratic Party was already an anomaly from a socio-economic point of view. And so far as discrimination was concerned, most of the barriers against Jews had already been toppled. The principle that was responsible for this development was the belief that justice required individuals to be treated on their own merits as individuals, without regard, as the old liberal catechism I used to recite in school when I was a kid, without regard to race, color, or creed. But, national origin too, I forgot. But by 1967, this formerly sacred liberal principle was giving way among liberals to a new conception of social justice that entailed the reintroduction of the kind of quota system that had always been used as a way of keeping Jews out and down. And then came the Six-Day War. In the weeks leading up to it, President Nasser of Egypt and the leaders of the other Arab countries bordering Israel issued a steady stream of blood-curdling threats to destroy Israel and drive its Jewish inhabitants, as Nasser himself put it, into the sea. Thus, for the second time in the 20th century, and only a quarter of a century after the first, a major community of Jews was threatened with annihilation, actual annihilation. And once again, the world, as it seemed, stood complacently by. The difference, the literally earth-shaking difference, was that this time, the Jews living under a genocidal threat had the means and the will to defend themselves against it. And so the Israelis did. In 6 short days, they averted another Holocaust by waging one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. Most American Jews celebrated that victory. But on the left, and especially among the intellectuals who made home there, the outcome of the Six-Day War gave anything but cause for celebration. On the contrary, the Israeli victory became the occasion for an outbreak of self-anti-Zionism, but that was more often than not the cover for a new species of anti-Semitism, through which the hatred that had from time immemorial been directed at the Jewish people was now directed at the Jewish state. In the process, the libelous charges that anti-Semites had always hurled at Jews living in the diaspora were being translated into the language of international affairs and applied to the Israelis. When sounded the alarm over this ominous development, we were accused of trying to fend off any criticism of Israel's policies by smearing it as anti-Semitism. This ploy is still being used, but as the years have passed and as the new anti-Zionism has spread like a metastasizing malignancy through the major institutions of the liberal culture, the universities, the mainstream media, the world of the arts and entertainment, not to mention the UN, It's become harder and harder to maintain the pretense that there's any significant difference between the new anti-Zionism and the old anti-Semitism. Thus it came about that the political left, which had for so long, and with good reason, commanded the loyalty of the Jews, was now offering hospitality to ideas and sentiments that were blatantly hostile to Jews. To cite only one of the many examples I discuss in my book, The Nation, perhaps the most influential magazine of the American left, and one that had once upon a time been a staunch supporter of Israel, could now publish an article by Gore Vidal in which Israel was described as, and I quote, a predatory nation busy stealing other people's land in the name of an alien theocracy, and in which American Jews, all American Jews, were denounced as, and I quote again, an Israeli fifth column. Now, it was bad enough that a major liberal periodical could play host to this naked invocation of two of the classic themes of anti-Semitism, the Jew as a disloyal alien and the Jew as a conspiratorial manipulator of malign power, dangerous to everyone else. But what was even worse was that Vidal's article elicited no more than a weak peep of protest from the magazine's sponsors and readers. The Vidal affair provided powerful confirmation for the argument some of us had been making since 1967, that anti-Semitism had found a new home on the left. And then, by a lucky coincidence, the Nation's opposite number on the right, National Review, became embroiled in a similar controversy of its own that provided commensurately powerful evidence for the argument we'd also been making since 1967, that anti-Semitism was becoming more and more unwelcome among conservatives. This controversy involved a member of National Review's editorial staff named Joseph Sobran, who had devoted a number of his syndicated columns to attacking not just the State of Israel, but also the Jewish people in general and Judaism as a religion. Accordingly, a letter of protest was sent to a long list of prominent conservative intellectuals, and in sharp contrast to the liberal intellectuals connected with the Nation, all the conservatives joined in expressing outrage at Sobran's anti-Semitic writings. And in spite of the fact that none of the clearly anti-Semitic Sobran pieces had appeared in National Review itself, the letter was also sent to its editor, William F. Buckley, Jr. But whereas Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, had responded to a similar letter denying that the Vidal piece was anti-Semitic or even, incredibly enough, anti-Israel, Buckley wrote an editorial dissociating his magazine from Sobran on this issue and admonishing him to begin respecting, I quote, the welcome structure of taboos concerning Israel and the Jews. What emerged from this dramatic contrast between the two cases was further evidence that anti-Semitism had largely, if not, as the name of Pat Buchanan reminds us, entirely been banished from its traditional home on the right, while, especially in the guise of anti-Zionism, it was meeting with more and more toleration and sometimes even approval on the left. This momentous reversal also manifested itself in the bitter debates over other issues of Jewish interest and concern, such as quotas and the plight of Soviet Jewry, that I analyze in detail in my book. So if you want to know what I have to say about them, you're going to have to read it. But it was and is in Christian attitudes toward Israel that the reversal of roles between left and right has most saliently been manifested, and thereby hangs a tale. Although there appears to have been some slippage in the intensity of Jewish concern for Israel, most American Jews, including most of the liberals among them, still care deeply about the security of Israel. And, as everyone knows, or should know by now, there is no group in America, probably not even the Jews themselves, which sides more passionately with Israel in the war being waged against it by the Arab Muslim world, and which is more steadfast in upholding Israel's right to defend itself against its sworn enemies than the so-called religious right. Yet, instead of forging a political alliance with this community, Jewish liberals look for ways to justify their refusal to do so. At the same time, they're perfectly willing to make common cause with the mainline Protestant denominations, despite the fact that unfriendliness and even outright hostility to Israel have become pervasive in that sector of the Christian world. A similar situation exists in the strictly political realm. All the poll data show self-described conservatives and Republicans sympathizing with Israel in much greater proportions than self-described liberals and Democrats. For example, in a Pew survey taken only early this year, 60% of conservatives sided with Israel as against only 8% with the Palestinians, whereas the comparable numbers among liberals were only about half as much for Israel, that is 33%, but nearly 3 times as much, 21%, for the Palestinians. The same pattern shows up in party affiliation, where 69% of Republicans express more sympathy for Israel than for the Palestinians, while only 42% of Democrats do, a gap of 27 points. Nevertheless, the average Jewish vote for Democratic presidential candidates, an astonishing 75%, has remained what it was between 1928 and the Great Reversal of 1967. And it's still far higher than that of any other group. And when I say still, I most emphatically include 2008. Running against John McCain, Barack Obama captured 78% of the Jewish vote, which was, and get a load of this, 25 points higher than the 53% he scored with the electorate as a whole, 35 points higher than the pro-Obama white vote in general, and even 11 points higher than his Hispanic vote. Broken down by religion, the Jewish vote for Obama was 33 points higher than the Protestant vote and 24 points higher than the Catholic vote for him. Only with blacks, who gave him 95% of their vote, did Obama do better than he did with the Jews. And so it continues to go with the liberal agenda. On the older economic and political issues like government spending, benefits to the poor, and organized labor, as well as on the newer issues that form the battlegrounds of the culture war, abortion, gay marriage, school prayer, assisted suicide, gun control, and so on, the polls consistently show huge gaps between Jews and all other Americans. Which brings me finally to the question I wrote my book to answer. Why are Jews so stubbornly committed to whatever happens to be on the liberal agenda at any given moment? And why have they continued voting for Democrats in spite of the changes that have taken place since 1967, both in their socioeconomic position and in the Democratic Party itself, that might have been expected to drive them away? Many attempts have been made to account for this anomalous phenomenon, and they fall into 3 large categories: historical, sociological, and religious. Those who favor the historical explanation tell us that Jews have long memories and that they are therefore still mindful of the centuries of oppression their people suffered at the hands of the right as against the help they were given by the forces of the left. In my judgment, however, to the extent that the historical explanation is valid, it's a case that resembles the guns of Singapore. Before the outbreak of World War II, as some of you will remember, these artillery pieces were pointed in the direction from which the island had last been invaded, and so they proved utterly useless against the Japanese, who simply invaded from the other side. For the Jews, the enemy had always been on the right, and it was from there that he had only yesterday launched the most murderous assault on them in their long history. It may be understandable that they would keep looking for the enemy where he was last seen, but as the British discovered in 1940 from the guns of Singapore, fighting the last war can only bring defeat in the new war that has just broken out. The sociological factors that are often invoked include minority status, education, parental influence, greater degree of comfort Jews feel in the company of the kind of people who belong to the Democratic Party, the fear of being punished socially from descending from the political orthodoxies of the community, and even lately a theory of genetic inheritance. I kid you not. Not surprisingly, the most original theory is found in an article by Irving Kristol, where with his usual boldness he proposes that Jews, though notorious for their intelligence, are actually stupid when it comes to politics. But the most popular explanation by far traces Jewish liberalism all the way back to the Jewish values that are said to derive from the commandments of Judaism, or more broadly, the spirit of the Jewish religious tradition. There is, however, a fatal flaw at the heart of the theory that the liberalism of American Jews stems from the teachings of Judaism. If the theory were valid, the Orthodox would be the most liberal sector of the Jewish community, for it's they who are the most familiar with the Jewish religious tradition, who are most deeply influenced by its holy books, and whose lives are the most fully shaped by its commandments. Yet, the Orthodox are the least liberal of all their fellow Jews. The Orthodox enclaves are the only Jewish neighborhoods where conservative candidates get any votes to speak of. Even more telling is that on every one of the issues involved in the culture war, the Orthodox oppose the politically correct liberal positions taken by most other American Jews, and precisely because these positions conflict with Jewish law. Jewish law permits abortion only to protect the life of the mother, for example. It forbids sex between men, prohibits suicide except when the only alternatives are forced conversion and incest, and so on. I have much more to say in my book about why the religious theory, as commonly expounded, fails to explain the continuing commitment of American Jews to liberalism. I also analyze each one of the other theories before concluding that they're all either inadequate or just plain wrong. I do, however, go on to argue that there's another way of framing the religious theory that does provide an answer to the question. It is that liberalism has become more, much, much more than a political position to most American Jews. It has become a religion in its own right, complete with its own Torah and its own set of commandments. Through a process I describe at length in the book, this new Torah, the Torah of liberalism as I call it, has superseded the Torah of Judaism to the point where we can say without exaggeration that liberalism, not Judaism, is now the religion of most American Jews. I don't go as far as the cruel wit who once described the services in a Reformed temple as the Democratic Party at prayer. And the other wit who said that Reformed Judaism in general is the Democratic Party platform with holidays thrown in. But I do contend that many American Jews sincerely believe that adhering to the Torah of liberalism makes them good Jews, even though in any conflict between the new Torah and the old, new always trumps the old. To this new Torah, its adherents give the same measure of steadfast devotion and scrupulous obedience that their forebears gave to the Torah of Judaism. So too, they regard moving from left to right or from liberalism to conservatism with the same horror that their forefathers felt at conversion to Christianity. Now, of course, when I speak of the conflict between left and right, or between liberals and conservatives, I'm talking about a divide wider than the conflict between Democrats and Republicans and deeper than electoral politics. What the great issue between the two political communities fundamentally turns on is how they feel about the nature of American society. With all exceptions duly noted, I think it fair to say that what the left mainly sees when it looks at America is injustice and oppression of every kind, economic, social, and political. By sharp contrast, the right sees a complex of traditions, principles, and institutions that have made it possible for more freedom and, even factoring in periodic economic downturns, more prosperity to be enjoyed by more of its citizens than in any society known to human. It follows that what the liberals believe needs to be changed or discarded, not to mention apologized for to other nations, is precisely what conservatives are dedicated to preserving, reinvigorating, and proudly defending against attack. In this realm, too, American Jewry surely belongs with the conservatives rather than the liberals. For the social, political, and moral system that liberals wish to transform is the very system in and through which Jews found a home such as they had never discovered in all their forced wanderings throughout the centuries over the face of the earth. The Jewish immigrants who began coming here from East Europe in the 1880s were right to call America in Yiddish Die Goldene Medina, the Golden Land. There was no gold in the streets, as some of them may have imagined, and so they had to struggle, and struggle hard. But there was another kind of gold in America, a more precious kind than the gold of coins. There was freedom and there was opportunity. Blessed with these conditions and hampered by much less disabling forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination than Jews had previously grown accustomed to contending with, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these immigrants flourished, and not just in material terms, to an extent unprecedented in the history of their people. What I'm saying is that the Jewish experience in this country bears eloquent testimony to the precious virtues of the traditional American system. Surely then, we Jews have an obligation to join with its defenders against those who are blind or indifferent or antagonistic to the philosophical principles, the moral values, and the socio-economic institutions on whose health and vitality the traditional American system depends. In 2008, we were faced with a candidate who ran explicitly on the premise that the traditional American system was seriously flawed and in desperate need of radical change. As he said on the eve of the election on October 31st, 2008, quote, "We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." And he also had a record powerfully indicating that he would pursue policies dangerous to the security of Israel. Because of all this, I hoped for a while that my fellow Jews would finally break free of the liberalism to which they have remained in thrall, long past the point where it served either their interests or their ideals, whether as Jews or as Americans. That hope having been so resoundingly dashed, I now grasp for a bit of encouragement from the signs that buyer's remorse may be beginning to set in among Jews, as it also seems to be doing among the independents who voted for Obama. And so I'm now hoping against hope that the exposure of Obama as a false messiah will at last open the eyes of my fellow Jews to the correlative of the political creed that he so perfectly personifies and to which so many of them have for so long been so misguidedly loyal. Thanks very much.
Howard Yusuf from the Manhattan Institute. Norman will accept questions. And normal ground rules apply, I should say. Keep it short, form of a question. If you want to identify yourself, feel free.
Okay, J.P. Dunlin, Chief Executive Magazine. Norman, great address. What will it take to change people's minds? I mean, does Iran have to bomb Israel for folks to wake up?
Well, I'm sorry you picked that example because I was about to say only a traumatic event, such as a war, and I'm hoping that if any bombing is to be done over there, it will be Israel bombing Iran rather than the other way around. But I also think that you know, it's human affairs are mysterious, and the motions of opinion are even more mysterious, and there come turning points that appear without warning. I saw this a lot when I was editing the magazine. Changes in the climate of opinion that you would not have expected to happen. And I haven't given up hope that something of that sort will set in the American Jewish community. And I really do believe that, you know, Jews have had a lot of experience with false messiahs. And there's been much disillusion every few centuries with yet another one. This is the first non-Jewish messiah they've had to contend with. But the exposure of the false messiah as false has been traumatic in the past, and has led to deep changes of attitude among the Jews who had believed in the false messiah. And I'm hoping, as I said, that this might happen in the next few years.
My name is Sam Luft. Really one observation, one question. Just very quick observation. It would be interesting to know if in your research you could find out the demographics of that Jewish vote for Obama between the young and old. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, I've got stuff about that in the book. So again, you're going to have to get the book.
Okay. If I have some loose change, I'll buy it. But more interestingly, I'd like to hear your comments on this religious right that has been so supportive of Israel. We all understand that they have their own religious reasons for supporting unification of Israel, etc., etc. Did you get a sense in your own research how much of that religious right, which tends to be a conservative base, is really pro-Jewish value and pro-Judaism, if I can use that word, versus how much of it is really a religious reason to support Israel?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that you asked that question. It's an extremely important question because the fear of the religious right is probably the single most powerful obstacle to a change of heart among American Jews. Let me tell you something about what you call the religious agenda. There is one sect among evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants called the dispensationalists, who do believe that at the end of days, for their Messiah, that is Jesus Christ, to return, a necessary precondition is the ingathering of all the Jews to the Holy Land. And then there are, from the book of Revelation in the New Testament, there are visions of an apocalyptic war and the redemption of the world to follow. Now, these are, by the way, by no means the majority of the evangelicals. On that point, as I'll quote Irving Kristol again, who once said, well, okay, when that happens, we'll see, who's right. But in the meantime, there's no reason not to accept them as political friends. In fact, it's stupid not to accept them as political friends. The other point I want to make is actually more important. I know by now a good number of evangelical Christians. And I can tell you that what most of them, including the dispensationalists, believe, they believe in the literal truth of Scripture, which includes the Hebrew Bible, of course. what they call the Old Testament. In the book of Genesis, God says to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. All fundamentalist Protestants believe in the literal truth of that injunction. And they bless Israel because God will bless them for blessing Israel. They really believe this. It's hard for a lot of secularists to understand what that kind of belief amounts to, but it is a plain, verifiable, empirical fact that the vast majority, and possibly all evangelical, certainly fundamentalist Christians who accept the literal truth of every word of Scripture, base their support for Israel. And by the way, for Judaism as well. That's another story that I tell a bit about that in the book too. Don't have time for it now. But that is the most solid basis for the support of Israel in that community. And I think myself it's a blessing, and that it is a great shame as well as politically ridiculous for the Jews, for us Jews, to repudiate the hand that's offered in political friendship and also spiritual friendship when it's so desperately needed. And the reason I call for a change of alignment is I think it's to paraphrase something my wife once said, it's time for us to join the side that's on our side.
Ken.
Ken Gilman, has there been any interest in turning your book into a documentary film, either on television or another media?
Not yet, but I'm open to offers.
Somebody should pick it up, because that's the way you can get your message across.
Well, my editor at Doubleday is present, at least he was when we started. You know, somebody should talk to him.
Stanley Goldstein.
Let me turn to the other side of the equation. Why is it that when, let's say, President George W. Bush comes out strongly for Israel, appoints Jews to high posts, why does that not resonate at all with the Jewish community?
Well, again, I mean, I think the answer is the same as the answer I gave to the general question. You're talking about, I mean, George W. Bush was almost, created by central casting to appeal to all the what I would consider irrational, atavistic fears that liberal Jews have. To the extent that they have Jewish memories, it's the fear of Christianity. But to the extent that liberalism is now their religion, which I believe to be the case. By the way, when I say religion, I'm using the word seriously. I mean something you believe in as the most important thing in life. I mean, it's these are matters of the highest seriousness. It's not just a question of an opinion you pick up from an editorial. And so Bush was perfectly cast to arouse some of those atavistic fears. And at the same time, his identification with, known as a born-again Christian, also exacerbated matters for liberal Jews. And, as liberals, and members of the liberal church, believers in the liberal Torah, like every other liberal in the country, I mean, like non-Jewish liberals, they hated Bush for all the wrong reasons. I mean, everything good that Bush did or tried to do was another reason for hating him in the liberal community. And, Sholem Aleichem, the great Jewish humorist, once said, "What is the difference between a man and a carpenter?" Well, a carpenter lives and lives and lives till he dies, and so does a man. You don't get it. All right, okay. I said Jewish humor maybe is out of vogue. I was about to say what is the difference between a Jewish liberal and a liberal? And a Jewish liberal has such and such beliefs, and so does a liberal. So to the extent that my theory is right, and I believe it is, it would explain not just George W. Bush, but a lot of other phenomena. I mean, why why do a much greater percentage of Jewish women believe in the right to abortion rights? Much higher. And by the way, it's high among most women, but it's off the charts among Jewish women. And the same thing is true of gay marriage. Jews in general are off the charts as compared with any other group. I mean, it's as though I once said, you get the impression that when Moses came down from Sinai with 2 tablets, on one of them was written, right to choice, and the other was written gay rights. I mean, that was the sum total of the revelation from Sinai. So, without judging the merits of these points of view, I'm simply pointing out how far the liberal commitment goes among Jews.
Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. I want to flip the question because Jews have been strong allies of blacks, particularly in the civil rights movement, and yet they were, by and large, driven out of civil rights organizations. And in 1979, black leaders from across the country came together in New York and declared the Declaration of Independence from Jews and from Israel over the firing of Andy Young. My question to you is, given the strong alliance between blacks and Jews, why are so many black leaders, and we can name them all, why are so many black leaders anti-Semitic and anti-Israel?
Well, with all due humility, I was praising myself for humility when I started to instruct you, Michael, on a subject like this. It takes chutzpah, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway. Well, there is not a lot about it in the book. Look, the brutal truth is that there had been a taboo against the open expression of anti-Semitic ideas, sentiments, for the first 20 years after World War II, for obvious reasons. I mean, because of the Holocaust, people began to realize that even casual anti-Semitism, could wind up in the ovens of Auschwitz. And so you couldn't be, even if you were an anti-Semite, you had to be careful. Which is why, for example, especially on the right, because it's why, for example, Joe McCarthy chose 2 highly visible young Jewish assistants just to signal that he was not an anti-Semite. And there are many other examples of that. Even the John Birch Society expelled anti-Semites. So it was a tough sell, the new anti-Semitism, and it was brought back into American public discourse by blacks in 1967. This was the other pivotal event of that year, through the horrible teacher strike in New York of that year. You know about that, and I do have some of that about that in my book. It could only have been brought back by blacks, I now believe, because no one else could have gotten away with it. But because blacks had, so to speak, a better claim to victimhood than the Jews, they were given a special license to let the Jews have it. And the fact that most of those guys, who were, as you know better than I, not integrationists, they were black separatists, and black separatism then and even earlier always had a slight component of anti-Semitism in it. You see it in a book like Harold Cruz's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And they were in the ascendant at that point. Black power was replacing the old civil rights establishment as the dominant current of opinion in the black community, which was highly conducive to the resurrection of the old anti-Semitism. That's what happened historically. Why is another matter. Psychologically, what the relation between blacks and Jews is a very twisted and complex affair. But the plain fact of the matter is that, yes, there had been an alliance. I mean, it was a Jew who founded the NAACP. Now listen to what the NAACP says these days in the person of Julian Bond, once a moderate, as you know. I can't go into the question of why, but it is a fact that that having been allies and friends for a long time, I think the rift was, and I'm sorry, but I believe that the rift was totally the fault of these black nationalists. I mean, they declared war on the Jews, and most of the liberal Jews feelings were terribly hurt. They couldn't understand how, I marched with Martin Luther King. How can they call me a racist? I remember the first time I was called a racist. It was by Stokely Carmichael, and I wanted to sue him for $1, and I was, of course, talked out of it by the lawyers, luckily. In any event, so that's the story, and I will shock you, perhaps, and others in this room by adding that I see Barack Obama as a product of the culture of the 60s and early 70s. This is where he lived, grew up. This is what the French call his formation. This is what he's been shaped by. It's what he knows. It's the default position in his head and in his spirit. And what you see in his presidency and his having been elected president is the culmination of what Mao Zedong was, the long march through the institutions that the left of the 60s took, and all the way into the White House. And I believe that only a black man could have done it, because Barack Obama got away with stuff during the campaign. I'm talking about Jeremiah Wright, Bill Ayers, some of the other things he said, that no white candidate would have lasted 24 hours for saying or being. So you have, perhaps God is punishing, America still for the sin of the sins of the past toward black people. Thomas Jefferson once said, I tremble for my people, for my nation, when I reflect that God is just. And he was talking about slavery, and he had slaves, of course. So I mean, it's in a way a terrible story, but I don't see anything to be gained by shielding one's eyes from the realities here. And nothing is forever, and I don't assume that this is going to. I may not live to see an improvement in the situation. I'm nearly 80 years old, Michael. Would you believe? But I don't preclude, a serious change in the decades to come, for the better, I mean.
Sure. Time for a couple more.
To the extent that liberalism is religion for American Jews, and religion is largely unexamined, unchallengeable beliefs, to what degree do you think that is changeable through rational and evidence-based argument?
To no degree. To 0 degree. And I'll tell you why. In the book, but that doesn't mean that's not the end of the story. In the book, I point out that an early father of the church, Tertullian, who was taunted by some of his Roman pagan friends for becoming a Christian. Say, how can you believe all that stuff? 3 gods and virgin birth and whatever. It's all ridiculous. It's absurd. And his answer was, I believe because it's absurd. I believe because it's absurd. And I compare liberal Jews of today to Tertullian, which is a double insult to them, of course. I mean, church father, and that no amount of rational argument or empirical evidence can shake the belief. In fact, it reinforces it, as it did with Tertullian. What can shake this kind of religious commitment is a traumatic event, a series of events, like, as I say, a war being the most common example, when things suddenly, the whole world suddenly looks transformed, and people are forced to begin re-examining all the assumptions that they had been making about the nature of the world before that. This is the kind of thing that might very well shake a lot of Jews loose. But I have no illusions. I didn't write this book in the expectation that it was going to convince anyone. On the contrary. But I still think that there may very well come a time, possibly at a very high price to be paid, when there will be a re-examination of some of these ideas and assumptions. I mean, you know, like I said, nothing is forever, and you know, although Jews have been on the left for a long time, they haven't been on the left for 3,000 years. They have a history that, you know, goes in different directions, and that may happen yet again.